And there's the stories of the, lobbyists writing checks on election night to the guy who they weren't supporting who happened to win. Because, oh, I'm sorry,
Oh, yeah.
I forgot to give you that contribution.
So, Paul, we've been looking at campaign finance reports because, that's one of the things that I like to do. I'm sure you've looked at your fair share of campaign finance reports, but I was looking in a state without term limits. And I've looked at lots of states with term limits, especially Michigan. And what you see is, when a seat is open, there's normally 2 or 3, 4 people who come in with, a decent but similar sized chunk of money. And they really duke it out. And you'll normally have some people who come in with a lesser amount of money. And sometimes those people go out and knock a lot of doors and can actually, play even up with the others. But I noticed a weird thing when I was looking at races in places without term limits, because I was looking at specifically places where there weren't open seats. And what I would see is these guys who are incumbents, who've been there for several years, who are in committee chair positions and whatnot, they wouldn't be raising any money. They'd have $5,000 or $10,000 coming into their campaign committee over the course of a cycle. And then all of a sudden, over the course of a month, you'd see 40,000, 40,000. And I'd look over the space of a year or multiple years, because I was looking to see over time, and there'd be nothing. And then all of a sudden, over the course of a cycle, they'd have 5,000 to 10,000 in donations. And then all of a sudden they'd have 40,000 come in one month on one report, and 40,000 or 50,000 or 80,000, for example, come in the next report. And I'm like, okay, something weird happened to this guy. And then I saw it happen in multiple places, and I thought, what's going on here? So we started to dig a little bit, and it turns out that most guys who are in state legislature, and they're protected because they don't, they've got the incumbent advantage and nobody's going to run against them, they don't raise a lot of money for themselves. They raise a lot of money for the speaker and for leadership PACs. And so they're making phone calls not to donate to my campaign committee, but to donate to the speakers or the leadership PACs. They're calling up their friends and whatnot. And in cases where they are getting it donated to their campaign and they're not having a race, they're writing other checks to other politicians' campaigns who are having races. So what happens when all of a sudden there's 40,000, 60,000, 80,000 coming in over 2 cycles? Paul, what would you guess happens in that scenario?
That other legislators or the leadership sends that money into their campaign coffers.
They do. A big chunk of it comes from, but the thing that keys that off is, let's say that you're not exactly happy with what your state rep is doing. You've talked to a lot of people in the community and nobody really cares for the guy. And you look up his campaign finance reports and you're like, well, this guy only raises $10,000 a year to run for the last 6 cycles. I can beat him. So you go down and you file and you put $20,000 in your campaign committee. And then what happens? All of a sudden, $40,000, $80,000, $100,000 over the next 2 to 3 months comes into his. It's very deceptive and easy. When you look at the numbers, it's very deceptive and easy to think that you can play in one of these races against an incumbent for a very low amount of money. But as soon as somebody files to challenge against an incumbent in these state house races, and the same thing goes for Congress,
right.
As soon as somebody files to challenge, all the special interest money starts dumping in. All the maximum, in a lot of places, it's $5,000 is the maximum a PAC can donate. They all check.
That legislator has a vote, right? That he's in, and they're going to get money. And there's the stories of the, lobbyists writing checks on election night to the guy who they weren't supporting who happened to win. Because, I'm sorry, I forgot to give you that contribution. But it also, people know, lobbyists gave money here or this special interest. But if the Speaker of the House gives your legislator a bunch of money, if some gas industry PAC gives you money, well, they might want you to vote their way on issues that affect them. What's the Speaker want? The Speaker wants you potentially to vote his way on every issue, every important issue. Why sometimes does a legislator vote in a way that this district didn't want him to do that? Because otherwise he's got to do all the work of raising money and staying when he's got a hostile speaker who can hurt him and who won't give him money. And the money changing where Speaker of the House and other leadership PACs are giving money to your legislator, they're buying him in a more powerful way, oftentimes, than any special interest would, who would only be interested maybe in one set of issues. And so that kind of control is huge. And one of the things that's been pointed out again and again about term limits in the states that have it for the legislature is that leadership doesn't have as much control. Leadership doesn't have the power they once did to insist on a more disciplined legislature. Well, I don't want a more disciplined legislature, not disciplined by, a powerful speaker or Senate president who dictates what's going on. So that's one of the things that term limits impacts, is that inner legislative pressure and control through campaign spending.
So we can look at two things here. We can look at Washington, D.C., and we can look at the state of Michigan to see two different scenarios of what happens. In Michigan, we have, and let's just look at the House. We're going to look at the Michigan State House. We're going to look at the U.S. House of Representatives. A third of the Michigan State House is up every 2 years. I mean, it might be a few more one year and a few less next year, but since it's a 6-year cycle, it's a third. Almost, I mean, it'll be within 5 seats of being a third every time, unless.
And you mean not that they're up? They're all up every 2 years.
They're all up. There will be
but a third is open seats. And a lot of people don't realize that, and the political scientists who want a more professionalized legislature aren't always fans of term limits. In fact, they're usually enemies of term limits, but they have loved term limits because it allows them to study change in legislatures in a far shorter period of time. Instead of waiting decades to have enough seats that are open where they might see how elections are going, there's a bunch, a third on average every 2 years. And open seat elections tend to be really competitive, and non-open seat elections tend to not be competitive. And that's not a totally new thing. I mean, the truth is, politics has always been that way, that if you're in office, you got name recognition, people know you, even if you're not thrilled with something, it might be better than the thing that, you don't know that you're scared of. So, and that's just one of a zillion: name recognition, all the other advantages. So
when we look at these two scenarios where you have a third of the seats being opened, and then for U.S. House of Representatives, you've got less than 10% it's probably about 25% of the seats are even competitive.
Right. And that's stretching the
generalization of competitive, not
right.
Open. I mean, open is such a small number. We've had, I want to say, 20-ish resignations out of 400 and some this year, people who are not running. That seems like a huge number to people, that this many people are not going to run for election next year. And
that really impacts campaign spending too. A lot of times, look, you can look at it and say, oh, money's evil. We don't want any money in politics. But the idea of somebody that you believe in running for office and you saying, I'm going to write a check because I believe in that person because of this issue, because they're for term limits and you're for term limits. There's nothing corrupt or ugly about that. That's beautiful. And if they didn't like term limits and you didn't like term limits and you wrote the check, that'd be beautiful too. You'd be wrong, but it'd be beautiful. And so it's not money that is corrupting. It's that somebody can take that money and do something they wouldn't otherwise do. In an open seat race, there's going to be more spending. It's going to be distributed more evenly than in an incumbent challenger way. And for that aspect of campaign finance reform, it's a lot better system when you have those open seats and there can be the free exchange of ideas with much more equalized spending than when you've got an incumbent who at the congressional level, you've got to raise millions of dollars just to be able to get your message out to even close to compete.
Here's the part of it that we're not taking into consideration that we see in Michigan now. So all this money comes into leadership. leadership raises all this money all year long. If you're not in a competitive race, you're still picking up the phone and you're making calls. And that money goes to the DCCC, or it goes to the RNC, or it goes to leadership PACs, or it goes to these other special. All this fundraising money is going into those things. And in a situation like U.S. Congress, or in a situation like a state without term limits, where there's a few seats that are open, that money, all that money from all those different places goes into a very small number of seats. But in the state of Michigan, it can't go into a small number of seats because, for one, there's a big number of seats. And for two, there's so many seats that are contested that leadership doesn't want to jump in and play on somebody's race and potentially burn a bridge when their guy loses, because those seats are a lot more competitive in the primaries. So you have a whole different dynamic where it takes away power from the state party establishment early in the races, and it really distributes it out into, and you'll see more fun. If you measure the amount of money that gets spent in races in Michigan, it's higher than the amount that gets spent in races in other states overall.
Which I think is good.
Which is good. But it's in other states, there's more money that gets spent there's less money, but it gets spent in a fewer races. Right. So they actually are spending more. And what happens more often than not is leadership knows when somebody's going to retire. They know when somebody's going to resign, when they're not going to run again, when they're going to go and take a lobbyist job and go do something else. And they anoint somebody. And they start lining up checks and bringing in money beforehand. So when that's finally announced, one person jumps in and he's got $50,000 in the bank that day, or $100,000 in the bank that day. It makes it very difficult for that to be anywhere near an open. I mean, they're really electing somebody who is going to go along with the will of leadership. And that person has a significant, I mean, it's almost like an incumbent advantage. If not, in some of these places, even better than an incumbent advantage, because they're, all this money is being raised on that person's behalf, rather than that person have to doing anything on their own, even in the position of incumbency. If we had a similar situation in Washington, D.C., we'd probably see more money spent, but less money would be able to focus on individual races. We have so many more competitive races around the country that our dollars going into a race and what we're doing on the ground would make a huge difference. If Fox News and CNN and MSNBC and ABC and CBS, if they were covering, a third of the races every year, even the media would be dispersed. Right now, when there's a very small number of races, I mean, everybody's talking about North Carolina because there's only 2 political races going on in the country. It's wall-to-wall coverage on the 3 networks on 2 political races. If there were, what's a third of 435, Paul?
160, 175?
Yeah, somewhere in there. If there were that many open, there would, I mean, what are they going to cover that many religiously? No, people would have to be broken down, and they'd have to cover it regionally. They'd have to do more stuff. There'd be less power behind each one of those races. Where are the big donors going to send their money? Now they got to write 135 checks, or they just got to write 25 checks. I mean, it makes a big difference.
Yes. You're very right about that. That it the more that there's competitive races across the board, the more it gets decided at the grassroots, because a small cabal of wealthy interests cannot just rifle shot them. They've got to be engaged, and that's going to create a process by which we get better people into office.
It's like if you go to the roulette table and you want to cover half the numbers, it's really expensive. But if you know that you've only got to cover 20 races, 20 numbers in the roulette table, you can cover 20 with a significant amount and make money back. That's what a big player looks at. Little players are just shut out of the system altogether. If you made it so that they had to cover a half or a third of those numbers every time, their dollars go a lot less far, and what it buys would be a lot less.
Yes, and I think you'll also see less special interest spending, because what they want is that guy who's going to be with them, and it's just harder to buy that, because the upside for the politician to sell out is to be there term after term after term, protected by these special interests. Well, if I can't be there term after term after term, even if I'm willing to sell out to special interests, why do it? And it just deflates that whole money go round.
Well, we talked about this in a previous video, but if you had that kind of turnover, I mean, right now you can go and lobby, and let's say you go and talk to, you have a meeting with 5 different congressmen a week, and you can do, I think you'd be probably stretching it to do 10 meetings in a month if you were a really good, well-connected lobbyist. What if every 2 years you had to meet a third of them new, and a third of the ones that you had a relationship with were gone? How much more expensive would it be to lobby? And so these guys are getting off cheap right now. They pay somebody, they get the person who go around and meet, all these different people, build the relationships. That person sticks around for 15, 20, 30 years. I mean, they don't have to keep going and making a visit, but if you had a crop of new people coming in every year, I mean, you're going to have what, 20 times as many lobbyists to do the same work, and then they're going to have to do the job again in 4 years. I mean, give me that world all day long. That's what I want.
Yeah. And again, it's just the whole advantage structure of the current system in those sweetheart deals is really, really diminished when you've got limited terms.
It is. This is Scott Tillman. I'm here with Paul Jacob. Paul, you're with Liberty Initiative Fund, and we're talking term limits. For more information on term limits, go to termlimits.com. Thank you.